Hello there, folks, and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's Global Summit 12 presentation of Understanding America's 21st Century Diplomacy, Lessons from the Front Lines of Europe and Asia. I'm Ben Spigen, I'm the Vice President at the JES. In this program, which originally aired live on Tuesday, May 25th, 2021, JES Global Summit Chairman Steve Scully interviews Christopher Hill, four-time ambassador, former Assistant Secretary of State, and author of the memoir, Outpost, a Diplomat at Work, about his storied career and today's foreign policy challenges. Before we get to the program, I'd like to thank all of our event sponsors, Erie Insurance, Erie News Now, the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, WQLN Public Media, and the American Tapestry Project, and our Global Summit event partner, the City Club of Cleveland. And I'd like to remind you that you can access additional programs to stream on demand at jeserie.org, where you'll also find a wide range of publications, from reports, essays, timely writings, and more. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date with all JES content. Now, here's Understanding America's 21st Century Diplomacy, Lessons from the Front Lines of Europe and Asia.
Ben, thank you. And it will take me almost an hour to introduce the impressive, impeccable career of our guest. But let me give you some of the highlights. He grew up in a foreign policy family. He gave back to his country and to the world as a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon. He is fluent in 5 languages. He received his master's degree from the Naval War College. Out with his new book on U.S. foreign policy, served as the dean of the Joseph Corbell School at the University of Denver. My connection there, I taught there for about 7 years. He has represented our country on so many different levels, and we'll talk about many of these as the ambassador, among other places, to Poland and Macedonia, special envoy to Kosovo, the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea, to South Korea, special assistant to the president. Just an impressive individual, writer, thinker, and truly one of the brightest minds in U.S. foreign policy. So what a treat to welcome Ambassador Christopher Hill to the Erie community, to the Jefferson Educational Society, and a lot to talk about. So Ambassador Hill, on behalf of the Jefferson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to sort of virtually be in Erie. I hope to come at some point. But Steve, it's great to see you. I actually attended some of those White House correspondence balls when you were actually hosting the event. So, and needless to say, I've seen you in many a day on C-SPAN. So great to see you, Steve.
Well, the honor and pleasure is ours. There's a lot to talk about. I want to begin with some news today, and then I'm going to take a step back and get a broader picture. But certainly with Secretary of State Tony Blinken in Jerusalem. He's going to be in Egypt and Jordan tomorrow. U.S. aid to the Palestinian territory. The death toll that is horrific, more than 250 Palestinians killed, about a dozen Israelis. And the U.S. saying, we want to create an environment of negotiations, but we're not going to get directly involved quite yet in a peace process. So give us a sense of what is going on in the Middle East, in particular with Israel and the Palestinian territory.
Well, you know, this is a very tough problem. It's gone on for many years. It's been especially difficult in terms of, can there be a Palestinian state? If so, what's it going to look like? Right now, you have Palestinian areas in the West Bank, and then you have Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And the thing about the Gaza is it's essentially the Palestinian group that runs it is an organization called Hamas that the U.S. has for a number of years branded a terrorist organization. And, without getting into the issue of, who started this and where are we, what we have seen is a kind of horrific exchange of projectiles. Some Israeli citizens have been killed. And many Palestinians have been killed. So the first thing you always want to do is to stop the killing. I mean, just stop, somehow come up with a ceasefire. But the problem with ceasefires is they become a kind of bridge to nowhere unless you can kind of figure out what you're going to do on the other end of that ceasefire. What you want to do is say, okay, these are a set of political arrangements we're going to try to organize, and to get to that, we're going to have a ceasefire. But with all these rockets going back and forth, they really wanted to get the ceasefire done first. And it's very tough when you get a ceasefire And then you have to scramble to try to create something, some kind of negotiation on the other end of it. So our Secretary of State flew out there in a hurry. And now the question is, can he negotiate something? And just to make it even a little tougher, he's got to negotiate with Palestinians who are not in Hamas. And Hamas is what, of course, controls Gaza, because we're not going to negotiate with a terrorist organization. So real tall order. And I think what is critical is he's already put on the table the idea that the U.S. is going to be involved in the reconstruction of some of these places destroyed by Israeli airstrikes. But ultimately, we're going to have some kind of political arrangement going forward. President Trump was not in favor of the two-state solution, where the Palestinians have their own state, not part of Israel. And this was an idea that goes back in time. Certainly, George W. Bush favored it, and President Biden favors it as well. But it's, I would say, some of these internal issues involving Israel have not been taken up with a lot of effort in recent years. Certainly, the Trump administration did a lot of good work in terms of trying to get Israel stitched together with some of its Arab neighbors in terms of those diplomatic recognitions. But that's not going to solve the problem in Gaza. And so I can assure you, our Secretary of State is into it right now, and it's going to be tough.
The other major development, as you know, is the announcement formally today that in Geneva, Switzerland, on June 16th, President Biden will meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Some significance to that, because as you well know, that was the same location where Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet leader, met with President Reagan in 1985. Then over the weekend, you have a Ryanair plane that is flying over Belarusian airspace, forced to land in Minsk. A opposition journalist was pulled off the plane, a young journalist in his 20s, along with his Russian girlfriend, and then the plane goes on to its route. And of course, you have Alexei Navalny, who is the opposition leader to Putin, who remains in a Russian jail, almost died from a self-imposed food strike. So there's a lot of different variables going on in Russia with this meeting. So set the stage of what is on the agenda for President Biden, and just how big of a task is it for him?
I think it's very necessary for our president to sit down with the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, and to try to at least set some rules of the road here, because what we see from the Russian side is a kind of extreme belligerence toward the U.S. There's no question they have interfered in our elections. That's kind of sacred ground for a democracy like ours, and to have Russia interfere with that, we just cannot allow that. But we also cannot allow this kind of phenomena. Russia is often described as a declining power. Its demography is down. A lot of things are down. It doesn't really have a huge economy. The economy is less than that of, say, Italy or Spain. It's not an enormous sort of superpower as we used to think of it in the past. But it does have a lot of nuclear weapons, and it does have a leader who seems quite aggressive and quite willing to kind of do things that are, not in the sort of approach that we really need, that is trying to negotiate things. His unilateral taking of Crimea from Ukraine was unfortunately very popular among many Russians, but it certainly created, I think, some of the problems we've seen today. And certainly Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, who's been a Putin ally, I mean, what he resorted to in taking, this was a flight from Athens to Lithuania, not going to Belarus, but because of the geography, the flight plan of the plane went over Western Belarus, at which point the Belarusian Air Force scrambled a jet and essentially forced a commercial liner, which is Ryanair, a British-owned discount company, and forced it to land in order to arrest this guy. Now, what they say, what the Belarusian government has said, well, you know, you Americans, you've done this with terrorists, and he's a terrorist that we've wanted. Well, to call this 26-year-old journalist a terrorist is a bit of a stretch, to be sure. And so there's going to be a lot of effort to deal with Belarus on this. But I think that kind of issue is going to come up with President Putin. And I think in addition to Ukraine and his continued interference in that country's internal affairs, I think the whole issue of cyber security and those questions, which are kind of 21st century questions. I mean, these were not what we used to talk about with the Russians in the Cold War, but we need some real rules of the road with that. So tall order coming up.
I want to come back to really the 30,000 foot level, but I wanted to divert for just a moment to talk about why it's important to understand U.S. foreign policy. You're speaking to a community in Northwest Pennsylvania, maybe Southern New York, part of Eastern Ohio. Why is it important for us to understand what's going on around the world? And I should point out that the Jefferson is here in part because of you, because you helped bring Dr. Ferrari to the U.S. back in the late 1990s. And I know you talked about this before we began, so share those insights as well, if you could.
Well, you know, a lot of problems in the world happen in far away places, often very small places, that many Americans haven't really heard very much about. Kosovo may be a household name to many people today. It sure wasn't before the conflict. Same with Bosnia, which took place a few years before. And so Americans might say, well, why is this important to us? And the answer is these problems don't just stay on these edges. They can come in and affect some of the central relationships that we have in the world. A problem in Belarus, I can assure you, is going to affect our relationship with Russia. And still people would say, well, why do we worry so much about that? Well, it's a very interconnected world. Our economy is very much connected to a lot of pieces out there. Whether it's indirectly on the issue of energy supplies to Western Europe that come from Russia, whether it's microchips that might come from somewhere in Asia, which affect productions of cars. And now what we're seeing actually as this pandemic begins to wind down, provided we all get our shots, but as we see with that pandemic winding down, we have a what's known as a supply chain problem where, you know, you can't go ahead and make a car without the chips, and you can't get the chips if you don't get the silicone from somewhere. So all of these are worldwide supply chains. And the US, if we're going to have a successful economy, and if we're going to be able to kind of manage our interests in the world, we've got to be engaged in the world. And there are those who say, well, you know, the time of US is over. Well, if you want to believe that, first of all, you're in for a sort of law of the jungle coming up, and I'm not sure that's what our country really needs. Secondly, if you say that the time of the US has passed, and we do have some declinists who say, well, the US can't continue to do this, well, tell me who's going to replace us. And I think we find that whether we like it or not, we are engaged in these problems. And, you know, to some extent, it's our fate. But to some extent, I think it's very much in our interest that we understand these problems and we get to them. It is before they get to us. It is much better that the U.S. handle these things with a few diplomats than with battalions of troops. By the time you've sent the army, it really signifies that we've kind of lost the diplomatic battles. And so it is much better to be out there with a few diplomats than to have to send our troops.
So from here on out, let it be on the record that we will give you full credit for Dr. Ferki Ferrari, because in fact, you are in part responsible for why he is in Erie. When he came to the US, he tells the story that he could move close to New York.
Yeah.
He didn't realize New York meant Jamestown, not New York City.
Yeah, right. You know, that Kosovo conflict, we had thousands of Kosovars stacked up on the Macedonian border. And Ferki was one of them. And the problem was the Macedonians didn't want to open the border because they felt they are taking the brunt of this war. They had nothing to do with the war, and they're saying, come on, countries, if we're going to take all these refugees, how about you taking some? Not a tough position on their part, to be sure, but not unreasonable. So our little embassy, working with, in fact, we had a lot of people working on this problem. We got the Macedonians to open up a refugee camp. And then we assured the Macedonians that we called it a transit camp. So they wouldn't think these people from Kosovo were coming to stay in Kosovo. And when you have a country of 2 million people and you're going to bring in 400,000 refugees, it really counts. So we worked with other countries, Norway, I remember they were one of the first, and we began to get refugees to go to some of these other countries in the hopes that eventually they'd be able to come back, and many did. So Fergie got on a plane to the U.S. as part of the quota of refugees that the U.S. took, and because we were willing to take refugees, many other countries took them. And often in diplomacy, you've got to lead with example. You've got to do certain things and then kind of challenge other people to do things. And that's exactly what we did in Kosovo. And frankly, tough problem, but it did work out.
Well, one final point, and then we'll move on. It's got to make you feel good that tonight you meet somebody more than 20 years later.
I bet it does.
Who are responsible, and now he is a success story.
Yeah, and you bet it feels good. I didn't know about this. I just found out about it a few minutes ago. But it's a terrific story, and it really speaks to our country and our willingness to open our arms to people in great need. And we have expectations. We have expectations that they do certain things and behave as Americans. And when they do all those things, it is just a wonderful result to see. Because I live in New York City right now, and I was just down in Lower Manhattan. You can see the Statue of Liberty there. Well, you don't see it from Kennedy Airport where you arrive, but so many millions of Americans saw that statue. It really means a great deal to our country.
Ambassador Hill, let's turn to what I think is probably the biggest foreign policy challenge facing this administration. The president has said so, and that is the challenges and the threats from China. So again, at the 30,000 foot level, there are military exercises going on. There are economic issues between our two countries. If you could kind of walk through those challenges and explain why it's important for Americans to understand the impact they have on their daily lives.
Yeah, first of all, I think in the long run, China is going to be around, and we're going to be around. We're going to have to be able to speak a common language and kind of work with the Chinese on a host of issues and do it across the table rather than across some demilitarized zone. But certainly it has been difficult in recent years. The Chinese have been quite a competitor. They've been a competitor economically. Some of the problems in our economy have to do with technological transformation, but many of them had to do with countries such as China kind of undercutting our efforts, making it difficult for U.S. companies to do business there without transferring technology to the Chinese. These are practices that are frankly unfair, and I think it's appropriate that successive administrations have said to the Chinese, enough is enough. But we're also seeing from China a kind of belligerence toward some of our allies, our countries that we've worked with over the years. In South Korea's case, China is really, when South Korea deployed some missiles to protect them against North Korean attacks, the Chinese felt that the missiles were aimed at them, and the Chinese really threw the book at the South Koreans. And so we had to defend our South Korean allies. And if there's any doubt in an alliance member that we will help, that could be the end of the alliance. So I think we were very right to be very concerned about that. Similarly, there's a thing called the South China Sea. And in the South China Sea, the Chinese have exerted or claimed that it's Chinese territory. So they've taken something called the South China Sea and tried to turn it into a southern Chinese lake. So that also affects a number of our close allies. And if our allies don't see that the U.S. is engaged in it, they won't be our allies. They'll cut deals with China rather than work with us. So I think it's been very important for maintaining these alliances and make sure that some of these problems, which are tough to deal with, but nonetheless problems we keep away from our shores and many miles away from us. And the way we do that is through a very vigorous forward deployed diplomacy. And I think we have one of the best diplomatic services in the world. And I think we better keep it that way and make sure that when we have problems in our diplomacy that we shore it up and make sure our people are out there defending our interests.
I hope you have a glass of water. Take a sip of water if you want. Outpost is the newest book by Ambassador Christopher Hill. He served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2005 until 2009. He is a key member of the U.S. foreign policy team, served as a member of the six-party talks with the North Korean leader, which we'll talk about in just a moment. His newest book, which is behind him, Outpost, as we said earlier, fluent in 5 languages. And I want to ask you about the intersection of Joseph Corbell, Madeline Albright, Christopher Hill, and Condoleezza Rice.
Yeah, it was quite remarkable. Joseph Corbell, of course, was a Czech diplomat before World War II. So he saw his country kind of carved up and then taken over by Germany after the Munich Agreement in 1938. And just as the country emerged back on the map in 1945, the Soviets came in and had these series of kind of phony referenda to suggest that the people in the then called Czechoslovakia, somehow wanted to be an ally of the Soviet Union. Well, at that point, Joseph Corbell, eventually he had to leave. He took his young family with him. They were in New York City for a while, and then he was offered a place out in Denver. So he drove a car with his wife sitting next to him and the 3 kids in the back seat. And his wife was the navigator, and she knew that Denver was supposed to be 5,280 feet high, and she kept saying, "Joseph, we should be going up." And finally, they did arrive after driving through the Great Plains and arrived in Denver. And Joseph Corbell felt very strongly that the U.S. Needed to be more engaged, more aware of these foreign policy issues. He had seen some of the worst of these problems, and so he turned a few courses at the university into a school of international studies, and that's what he has now, or what Denver has now.
And of course, his daughter.
Oh, and then of course his daughter, Madeline Albright, was very enterprising young girl. When there were football games, she would put out some cones and sell some parking spaces in front of their house to the fans there. I don't know if they charge for the parking spaces, but she then went on to school at Wellesley College in Massachusetts, and then here to Columbia University, where I'm currently teaching. And so she was the offspring of Joseph Corbell. But in the meantime, another student whose father had taken her from Alabama to Colorado, and they arrived in Denver. And her name was Condoleezza Rice, and she went to school at the University of Denver and took an interest in foreign policy thanks to the father of Madeline Albright. And if you ever wonder why Condoleezza Rice wrote a thesis on the Czechoslovak military, I think we can see how that happened. So she was really one of the prodigies of not only the university but of Dr. Corbell. So these two women both have this connection, and they get together from time to time. Usually they have kind of different views on the issue. One's a Democrat and the other's a Republican, but somehow they certainly do share this this mentor, in effect, Dr. Joseph Corbell.
I have a great idea. Let's get the two of them to Erie and have you moderate a conversation. Now, wouldn't that be worth the price of admission?
Yeah, I think it would be worth the price of admission. Absolutely.
Let's talk about your role as the U.S. ambassador to South Korea. As you know, when Donald Trump became president, Barack Obama, your former boss, said that that was the biggest foreign policy challenge that Donald Trump would inherit.
Yeah.
And like it or dislike it, President Trump tried to think outside the box, to have a series of summits with Kim Jong-un. So give us a sense of where relations are today between North and South Korea. Could there be a unified Korean peninsula? And what role, if any, the Biden administration would play in any negotiations with Kim Jong-un?
Yeah. Let me just back up really briefly to say I was career foreign service, meaning you go to all kinds of different places, worldwide availability. So I was an ambassador in Poland, a country that I knew very well from an earlier assignment. And I talked to Colin Powell and President George W. Bush at the end of my assignment in Poland. They sent me to Korea, and which I had also served earlier in my career. I was very pleased to be there as ambassador. But then about just a few months after I started my job there as ambassador, Condoleezza Rice became Secretary of State, and she asked me if I could come back from South Korea, become the assistant secretary, meaning I was the person in the State Department responsible for all those countries in East Asia, some 36 countries or so. And I would be the US representative to a process that the Chinese, under their president and President George W. Bush had set up, called the six-party process. And the idea was no one country could solve this. We needed to put our heads together: Russia, China, the US, Japan, and of course the two Koreas. Well, I worked on that for some 4 years. It was not easy. We did get the North Koreans to shut down their plutonium production. We got them to blow up the cooling tower. Sometimes we had to give them things in order to get some things. And, you know, when you're a negotiator out there and you got people back home saying, oh, what's he doing? Why is he doing that? Those people need to understand you're not negotiating with air. You're negotiating with someone who doesn't want to do anything that you want them to do. So it's a tough slog. We did make some progress. The North Korean leader, however, a man named Kim Jong-il, became Kim Jong-very ill in the summer of 2008, and soon had a series of strokes and died. And his son took over, a very inexperienced young leader, Kim Jong-un, the man who's there now. And Kim Jong-un has been very, very hard line on this issue of giving up those nuclear weapons. He rebuilt some of the reactor that we had dismantled, and he's continued to test missiles. And by the way, these missiles, it's not just little short-range missiles of the kind that we've seen in Gaza and Israel. These are long-range, in some cases, intercontinental missiles that could actually hit the United States. Plus, he has worked very hard, or had his scientists work very hard to have successful nuclear explosions. We don't know to the degree to which he's been able to take a nuclear bomb and put it on a missile. That's a very hard thing to do, but certainly sooner or later he's going to do that. So successive presidents have worked on this, and President Trump tried a kind of direct approach. He would meet Kim Jong-un, and the two of them would try to sort this out. Well, it's not that easy, and it doesn't usually have a happy ending. They worked very hard at it in Singapore back a couple of years ago, back in 2018. Then in 2019, they got together in Hanoi, and the North Koreans made an offer. The US was saying, we're not going to do that unless you make the full offer. And so it didn't really go very far. So here we are with still another president. I think the Biden administration, it took some time to kind of study this problem, study the history. You know, history, I found people always say to me, well, what's the most important thing in school that you learn to be a diplomat? And I would say it's history, because you learn what other people did before you've taken it up, and maybe you can avoid some of the mistakes they made. So, I put that at the top of my list of what to study in school to be an effective diplomat. So the Biden administration took some time to study this. And meanwhile, the South Koreans, who are a close ally of ours, and they're kind of nervous. Okay, Americans, good that you study this, but we really need to do something about this, because for South Koreans, this is a very close-in problem. And so there was a summit last week involving President Biden and Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president. And they essentially agreed that we're going to work together, as we need to do, on North Korea. The U.S. named a special envoy, someone who's going to work on this problem. He was my deputy during the time that I had it, and in the meantime, he's been ambassador in Korea, a very effective diplomat named Sung Kim. And so I'm hopeful that we'll at least get some kind of negotiation going and see if we can point out to the North Koreans that we have a lot of options for dealing with this problem, but we don't have the option of walking away. We have to stick with this. We have to get something done on this. And I think the basic problem is to convince the North Koreans that they're better off without these weapons than they are with these weapons. And that's a proposition that they're not buying, but I think it's the correct proposition that they need to start thinking about.
Mr. Ambassador, you have an incredible story, and I want to talk about your own personal story. You grew up in a family where your father was a career diplomat himself. You spent time in Cameroon. You didn't have to do that. You were a Peace Corps volunteer. So share with the Erie audience why you decided to become a volunteer, and more importantly, what that taught you about America being in Cameroon.
I was a senior in college, not really sure what I was going to do. This was mid-70s, so the draft was over, Vietnam draft was over, and I wanted to do something for our country, and I wasn't ready to make a firm decision of what I wanted to do. Do I want to go to grad school? Do I want to settle into a career? So I decided to take 2 years and go off to the Peace Corps. Well, the Peace Corps, I tell you, the first night you're in a place like Cameroon and you're in a cot and looking up in the ceiling and you're saying to yourself, why did I do this? What am I doing here? They gave me a Suzuki 125 dirt bike, and I went around auditing village credit unions, little banks in villages. And I realized how important the work was, maybe not to the world, but certainly to those villagers who had someone checking the books and making sure the individual ledgers tied up with the general ledger. Learned a lot of accounting skills in the Peace Corps. But another thing I learned was people really care about what our country thinks and what our country does. And even these small villages, I remember going into one chieftain's home, and he had a picture of President Kennedy there. I'm thinking, where do you get that picture? Why is he interested in President Kennedy? And he was just inspired by that story. This was in the mid-70s, so they were all inspired by us going to the moon. And they just thought we're an amazing country. They kept asking about the United States. And I realized, if one could have a career representing the greatest country in the world, why not? So a friend of mine who was in the Peace Corps, a kid named Ed Diem, and we drove our motorcycles, sort of easy rider style, down to Douala, which is one of the main cities in Cameroon, and we had a little 2-person consulate there. We took the Foreign Service exam together. And, in those days, there was no instant gratification. You didn't look it up on the internet. You waited months, and finally I got a thick envelope, meaning I passed. And then you go into the Foreign Service, and you're doing some tough jobs at a very junior level. Often it seems I did more time schlepping people's suitcases in from the airport than I did writing any telegrams. But sooner or later, those times passed, and you learn a lot from mentors. And then your job is not to give back to your mentors. They usually don't need your help. You turn around and you be a mentor to someone else and you bring other people up. And so over time, you have a service that I think is very well experienced with an absolute focus on learning on the job. So those junior officer positions were kind of positions where you were, learning the trade. And then at some point you meet someone really special. In my case, it was a guy named Dick Holbrook, who hired me to work with him on the Balkans. And it was an amazing experience.
And of course, one Kennedy connection to Erie, it was the day after the very first debate in 1960. I wasn't there, but he came to Erie after the debate in Chicago, and a huge crowd, estimated at about 25 to 30,000, outside what was once known as the Hotel Lawrence on State Street and 10th Street in Erie. You mentioned President Kennedy. Did he influence how you viewed, obviously, 1975, so a decade after his assassination, but you were certainly old enough to remember the influence he had on American foreign policy.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. And I taught a course here at Columbia this spring, and one of the readings I gave them was to read the Kennedy inaugural address in January '61. And when you read that address, kind of laying out the promise of this country and laying out the idea that we have responsibilities and we are, I think, every nation's hope for the world. And it's a big burden on us. And I mean, a lot of Americans are kind of a little tired of that burden, especially when we were involved in some of these wars that seem to, in fact, they've been nicknamed forever wars. There is a, concern that somehow we've gotten too involved in these issues. And frankly, I do feel we need to kind of look more carefully at some of these longer term involvements and see whether that's really in our interest to be there. But I think overall, Americans should be proud and want to serve this country and what we do for the world. I cannot imagine this world without the United States. And it's kind of up to us how we steer ourselves, how we, what issues we decide to involve our country in. It's really up to us. And I think we should understand that at the end of the day, we are a great force for good. And it's a better world as a result of our activity in that world.
And yet, as you know, our politics is very divided. I'm reminded what Secretary of State Albright told me in an interview once. And she basically said, if not the US, who? If not now, when?
Yeah. That's very true. We are very divided. And it is interesting because, throughout my Foreign Service career, I thought what would ultimately undo us was our economy. Because you'd see the Japanese or the Koreans or now the Chinese, and you kind of worry, can we handle that? And I think ultimately we're going to be fine economically. It's been tough, especially with technological transition in the economy. The fact that so many jobs that people's parents had or grandparents, those jobs don't exist, and so just the extraordinary changes in the economy have been really tough. The pressure it puts on the education system to, make sure people are learning the skills they'll need tomorrow and today and tomorrow. But I think we're going to make it there. What I worry about is this growing division within our society. I worry about the fact that it used to be, foreign policy issues, you tried to have a consensus that its politics would stop at the water's edge. But that's not the case right now. Politics kind of follows us to the four corners of the world. It's hard to say how this happened. I like to blame internet shopping. For example, if you order a book and it's some crazy book, but you happen to like reading that kind of crazy book, the algorithm will say, hey, here are 5 more crazy books like that you ought to read. Well, maybe they should have an algorithm that says, if you're going to read that book, you better read this book because it'll give you a better perspective on that book. But of course, that's not how algorithms are done. So I just feel that everyone is kind of retired into their corner. and just getting more and more materials that buttress their point of view and not doing enough listening to the other side. That's a discussion for another time. But, you know, when you're a diplomat, you're out there representing your country, and then you see some of the stuff happening here, you kind of worry because the best thing we've always had is our example. The fact that everyone wants to come here and wants to come here for good reason. And then if that example becomes tarnished, it's going to be a lot tougher out there to try to, you know, make sure that we can have situations and endings that are in our favor.
But of course, the must-read book is Outpost. What surprised you the most in researching this book that you just finished?
Well, it's funny. It's largely a memoir, and what surprised me is, you know, I had never thought of myself as someone who'd write a book. You know, when you're in the government and you have a memo that's gone on to 2.5 pages, wow, that's way too long. No one's even going to read page 2. So you are trained in the Foreign Service. You've got to write this stuff very lean, cut the adjectives, make sure you have active structures, not these Baroque sentences that you might have used in academia. You kind of cut to the chase. And so I sort of wonder, can I do a whole book like that? And it's always helpful to have a partner who's supporting you. And my wife was always supporting me, as in get back up there and write another chapter. And before you knew it, you know, I remember getting on to page 3 and telling her I'm in terra incognita. I've kind of moved on. But I've done this before. I got to page 4. It was a little like that Forrest Gump movie where you just keep going and going and going. Mm-hmm. And finally you stop, and I stopped on page 400. I did a lot of stories because I think people learn from stories. I mean, we've been learning from stories since we lived in caves. Stories are how you understand situations. So not a lot of political science, but a lot of sort of stories of interactions. And ultimately, you know, for all the talk about 21st century diplomacy, et cetera, there is technology that is new. It's still a game of relationships. It's still, you know, understanding. You're often trying to get people to do something they don't want to do. So the best way to do that is to have a relationship with that person. And I remember one time I was in Macedonia and trying to get the prime minister to agree to something he didn't want to do. I think it had to do with language, minority language in certain villages. And he said, you know, I'm going to get a lot of problems in the parliament if I try to push this through. But he said, I value the relationship with the United States. I want to be close to the United States. I want to be an ally. They were not yet in NATO. And so I'm going to do it. And I'm going to do it because I want the relationship with the US. And even though I'm going to have a lot of grief in the parliament tomorrow over this, I'm doing it because I want the relationship with you. So that's the situation you want to be in. You've created a kind of relationship, interpersonal often, but also just country to country. That's why these visits are so important when you get a head of state from another country coming in to see our head of state, our president. These are all part of relationships. So when the chips are down and you got a real problem, you call people up and you say, we're in a situation. And what you're looking for is countries to say, what can we do to help? I mean, the US got into a tough situation in Iraq, and without going into all that, I can just say, you know, we needed some allies, and certain countries just stepped up and said, okay, we're there. And they did it not because they necessarily shared our view on Iraq or frankly Afghanistan. They did it because of the relationship with us. And I think that's good diplomacy can get you into that circumstance.
Well, this is what they call in the business a tease, but I'm going to give you a heads up. Your most interesting interaction with either a U.S. president or a foreign leader. We want a story. So you think about that.
Okay.
This is from behind every great organization. There are some incredible people. We've talked about Ben Spagan. We've talked about Dr. Ferky Ferrardi, but Reverend Charles Brock is truly one of the inspirational leaders of this organization in Erie. He has a question, so let me share it with you. And Reverend Brock, thank you for this. Could you briefly define the foreign mission of America? So what is our foreign policy? What is our role in the world?
Well, our role in the world is to pursue our interests. and to make sure that we have the kind of relationships out there that if we are trying to sell a product out there, whether it's an aircraft or a tractor, that we have the relationships and the wherewithal to make sure that our business people are treated fairly and are able to compete fairly. That's, I think, probably our number one issue. We had a Secretary of State a number of years ago, and George Schultz, and he would bring in some person going out to be an ambassador, and he'd say, "So where's your country?" And the person would, look for, some small country to point out to the secretary where he was going to be assigned. And Secretary Schultz said, "No, that's not your country. This is your country," and he'd point at the United States. So we're there representing the U.S. Now, to do that, you have to understand the other guy. You have to understand where they're coming from. And so being knowledgeable, I think, is also very, very important. And ultimately, when you're in a situation where you cannot go forward with that country and you have to step back, you need to think ahead and see what those consequences are. That can be a fateful decision when you pull back from a country, say a country you've had good relations in the past, or a country that you can tell those relations are going to now get a lot worse. And you need to be ready for that. You need to understand it. So skilled and knowledgeable diplomats, I think, are key to making sure that as our country faces these problems in the world, that we are able to compete in the world and be able to mold the atmosphere to our interest.
And how incredible. I had the chance to interview George Schultz at 99. He just passed away, as you know, recently, but he was, up until the very end, just incredible, just as sharp as a tack.
Yeah. It was truly incredible. When an embassy hosts the visit of a Secretary of State, the whole embassy is mobilized to make that visit go well. And I can remember I was put in charge of a lot of the administrative tasks. This was when I was pretty junior officer in Seoul, and so I was working with the Koreans on that, and everything. It went well, and then you stand back and you see the secretary get off the plane. He's met by the right people. He has the right briefing materials. He says the right things. They say the right things to him, and so. As one of the control officer, along with my Korean colleague, his control, and we felt, hey, this visit has really brought our two countries closer together, and a big part of the credit goes to Secretary Schultz.
And to the staff that made him look good, or her look good. Another question from our Erie audience, and I'll read it verbatim. If you had the chance to go back and tell the Peace Corps Christopher Hill something that you know now that would be of great value to him then towards the future as a diplomat, what would it be? What a great question.
So, let me tell a little Peace Corps story that had I'll make it real quick, but
please do.
Had a really profound impact on me later as a diplomat. As I mentioned earlier, I had about 28 of these village and plantation credit unions. I went around on motorcycle, I checked their books, etc. I attended their annual general meetings. And in one, it was a tea plantation. There were about 600 members. And the board of directors was not a very good board of directors. They had too much of the loan money. I don't think the internal controls were very good. I was 22 years old at the time. And so I got up in front of this crowd, 600 people, and I told them, this board of directors has not served you well. And I laid out the reasons. They hadn't had enough internal meetings, all these sort of things that, an auditor, which is essentially what I was doing, would point out. And so everyone was very grateful. I got applause. I got people standing up saying, thank you very much, and kind of admonishing the board, who was kind of furious at me that day. And then I told them, so now we're going to have elections for a new board, and I have selected some people that I think you should consider for a new board. And they all said, oh, thank you very much, et cetera. And the way voting took place is there was no paper ballots or anything. You would simply have one board stand in one part of the pasture, one part of the meadow, and then the other board, the proposed board, would stand in another, and everyone voted for the old board. And so I remember thinking, wait a minute, thanked me They even admonished the old board. I mean, this old guy, shaking his fist at them and yelling at them in a tribal language that I wasn't able to understand, but he was furious with them. And then they all voted for them again. And what I took that to mean was, don't think you can tell another people how to vote or how to choose their governance. You can advise people. You can tell them what you think or what the issues are, but don't think you can tell other people how to run their country, or in this case, run their credit union. And I felt I learned a lot about what would be good diplomacy there. I mean, sometimes you just back away and you say, look, I can't work with this group of people, or our country should not be working with this regime. There are fateful moments when you have to do that, but you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you think you can speak for that country more than that country can speak for itself. So I think understanding the limits of diplomacy in that regard was something I got from the Peace Corps, and I think the Peace Corps has really had a really positive effect in terms of, for especially the people who went and the people who came back and told their families about what they did. And I think it's a very valuable thing for our country to have that capability.
Because as you point out, diplomacy is about people.
Yeah.
It's not about policies. It's about people, as we saw with Dr. Ferrari from Kosovo, but so many impacted by, we're seeing that right now in the Middle East, in Gaza.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and you saw in Gaza, we got our Secretary of State over there pretty quick. I mean, within days. And that's because people look to us for leadership. And leadership is a funny thing. A lot of people don't like it. They don't like, being told you've got to lead this. People feel very uncomfortable. But sometimes, the situation chooses you. You don't necessarily choose the situation.
I'm going to break this next question in two parts. First of all, would you agree or disagree that diplomacy took a back seat in the previous administration?
Whenever
You're a diplomat.
Yeah, whenever I've been in a foreign country, I try to avoid getting involved in their internal affairs, including the internal affairs of our own country. I certainly have some very strong feelings about that issue. Let me just suffice to say, I was not happy with the role the State Department has been given in recent years. And I think it's behooves the current administration, and I hope every other administration, to make sure that we have the finest diplomats, the diplomats that our people deserve. And I like the idea of diplomats who are not only well-trained, but who are, it's meritocracy. You get the best that we can get, and I think we'll get that. And I hope that American people have come to understand that when you send an army, you're through a whole other set of issues. General Mattis used to say, well, if you're not going to fund the State Department, you better give me some more bullets, because that's what we're going to end up having, more war. So he understood the need to support the diplomacy. And I think sometimes our country kind of conflates these national security, military issues with foreign policy. And often when you have to use the military, it's because something hasn't worked in your foreign policy. So I think as a country, we need to do a little better job of that.
So let me take what happened in Belarus as a flashpoint.
Yeah.
Let's certainly talk about the tragedy in Israel and Hamas as a flashpoint, but really more deeply rooted in some of the larger issues that Secretary of State Blinken is facing. So I guess generally speaking, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Eastern Europe, whether it's North Korea, whether it's China, how do we deal with these issues? You talked about the role of the US, and obviously it's different in different parts of the world, but generally speaking, how do you approach flashpoints that are symbolic of bigger, deeper issues in American foreign policy?
it's often the case in foreign policy, but it's the case in business and a lot of things where you have something that's very important and something that's very urgent. And sometimes the urgent is also very important, but sometimes it's not. And you'll find people tend to kind of move toward the more urgent than the important, thinking, well, we can discuss that important thing tomorrow, but this urgent thing we have to deal with today. But sometimes these urgent issues are also important. And obviously this rocket war between Israel and Hamas, who essentially run the Gaza, this group, which has been branded by the US for many years as a terrorist group. I mean, they attack civilians. And obviously this has been this flared up. And I know there are a lot of Americans who are very uncomfortable with the whole thing. They notice that there have been many more Palestinians killed than Israelis. And so there are people frustrated that somehow, why should we support Israel? And they blame Israel. I would argue that, you need to be careful with sort of conclusions of that kind. What we need are political arrangements that are going to work for both sides. And I think to a great extent, what we've seen with these flashes of violence is the failure over the years to really engage and continue to engage to find solutions that work with all. And so I think clearly there need to be some better arrangements for Gaza. The fact that it's basically controlled by Hamas is a pretty bad situation that I don't think should have been allowed to continue. I know that the Trump administration felt very strongly that it could find a lot of answers to these and other issues by negotiating with the Saudis. And that somehow if we did everything the Saudis wanted us to do on Iran, because the Saudis are kind of mortal enemies on Iran, then somehow the Saudis would kind of help make sure the Palestinians would be more receptive to various ideas, et cetera. So it was an idea that you could get the Saudis to be more admonishing and aggressive with the various Arabs that Israel has to deal with in its near abroad. And I'm not sure that's really worked out. And I don't think you can outsource your policy to anybody. I think you have to be fully engaged yourself. Again, I don't. I think the idea of getting Arab states to recognize Israel was a good idea. I see nothing bad about that. Of course, we were asked to do things in return, but I think ultimately we need to be more engaged in the issues of the Palestinian issue. Now, I hasten to add that one thing Americans learned during the Arab Spring was it's not all about Israel, the Middle East problems. For many Americans, they had never heard of Sunni and Shia. They had never heard of the fact that when you take Iraq and take a Sunni-led country, which is what Iraq was under Saddam Hussein, and flip it to become a Shia-led country, lo and behold, many of the Sunni Arab states are not happy with that. And I think that's something we needed to have thought through a little better than we did. So, it's one thing to be energetic. I think it's important, but you better be thoughtful as well. And I think to some extent, we've jumped into these kind of urgent and difficult issues without doing our homework. And if you don't do your homework, chances are you're going to make the wrong decision.
And I'm impressed that you've done your homework. You know what lake effect snow is and how that impacts Erie, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of cities not too far away from you, one on your west and one on your east, Buffalo and Cleveland. So the rest of us know all about lake effect snow. So when I see the smack dab between the two, makes sense. But I'm from New England, so we had the original Snow Bowl, so we know about.
There you go. Two final points. I want to hear your stories. A story from the presidents you've worked with or world leaders you've talked about. This is a sidebar question, but it came from one of our viewers. So very quickly, what do we do with Myanmar?
There was a case where we essentially did very little with Myanmar for many years. And the argument, understandably, was it's run by a junta. We won't deal with a regime that's come to power through a coup. I think overall, we didn't really know enough about Myanmar. And then we knew about one person, Aung San Suu Kyi. And so there was understandably a great effort to support her. And often you find this, one individual you want to support. And I understand that. It's a kind of a shortcut to kind of coming up with a policy. Lo and behold, the military essentially goes away and it becomes a civilian government. And then we discover that, wait a minute, there are other things going on in Myanmar that we really didn't know that much about. One of them was the Rohingya, the Muslim minority tribes in Myanmar. And then lo and behold, we found that civilian government was pretty rough on them. And then everyone was surprised about Aung San Suu Kyi and whether she supported that kind of tough policy. And, there are many universities in this country who had given her honorary degrees who said, no, we don't, we want to take back those honorary degrees. And I think a lot of this was, on the one hand, you're too cold and then you're too hot on something. And I think we should have tried to understand that not all of Myanmar or Burma's problems were going to go away once the military went away, that we needed to be present there and try to help them through this. And again, by present, I don't mean military, but it's in our interest to see that they make good choices. And now we have a military regime back. I think it's going to be a long way back for us, but I think ultimately, many people are being killed in this. There are many courageous people who've demonstrated against this government, and I think we always ought to stand on the side of those people. And if we get into a situation where it can be calmed down and progress can be made, we should not declare victory too soon. We should not say, okay, that's all okay, let's go on to the next crisis. We need to have a little more patience with these places and understand that sometimes when people come in, they're not saints, they're just less bad than the people who were there before. And don't expect too much from these people, and keep a clear mind and try to keep your emotions at bay as you look at these places. And I would say Myanmar is one of them.
Ambassador Hill, I speak on behalf of the entire Jefferson Educational Society, Dr. Ferky Ferrardi, and the entire staff. You have been beyond generous with your time, and we thank you so much. Look forward to having you in Erie in person, without the snow, we promise. But I have to conclude with your story or stories. So share with one of your favorite stories, your favorite interactions with a world leader, a U.S. president. You're among friends tonight.
Well, I tell you, on a world leader, you probably expect me to talk about a president or someone like Lech Wałęsa, who led the Solidarity movement in Poland. I remember seeing him in 1989 before it was all beginning to go down, and he was a shipyard worker from Gdańsk, and he said, this is going to be very difficult. I'm going to go see General Jaruzelski, not an easy guy to talk to. Remember General Jaruzelski of Poland with the dark sunglasses. And I remember Wałęsa said, I've learned over the years that it's easy to tighten the bolt. And that's what's happened in this country. They've just tightened it in terms of arresting people and things like that. Remember, they had martial law there. And he said, but I found it's much more difficult to loosen a bolt and loosen up a society and make sure that right decisions are made. And this from a man who did not study political science, but had an amazing understanding of people, amazing EQ, as we say, emotional intelligence. And I think what you look for in people who can kind of rise to the occasion, who can understand that this is a moment where everything I've got has got to be out there on the table. And I think Lech Wałęsa of Poland did that. you know, he later became president. And if you talk to a few polls about it, most people will say, well, he wasn't a great president, et cetera. But at a crucial moment, he rose to the occasion. So that's my story about a foreign leader who I think was truly magnificent. And when he came to the US Congress and gave a speech to the US Congress in the wake of these enormous changes in Poland, which brought down the Iron Curtain and caused changes all across Eastern Europe, his first words as he got up in front of a joint session of Congress was, "We the people." And as an electrician from Gdansk, I feel I am entitled to utter those words. So I find the man, that was an extraordinary moment. And then, you know, it's funny when you talk about American presidents, what you look for, you know, information is not knowledge, and knowledge is not wisdom. Wisdom is something else. It's not just the sum of information or knowledge. It comes from something else. And you know, what you look for in American presidents who can kind of summon that wisdom and understand, you know, what is the right way to handle an issue, what is the way to get to this to the problem and make the other person understand. And that's the kind of wisdom. And frankly, I've seen that from a number of our presidents. I saw that, you know, I was always amazed by Barack Obama's willingness to read briefing materials, including ones that I'd written, and just trying to understand this so that he could do the right thing when he had the visitor come in. In his case, it was a very difficult guest from Iraq. I remember George W. Bush doing the same and turning to me from the briefing material and said, all right, I understand this, but how can I get to him? How can I make him understand this? And so he was dealing at a different plane than just getting information and even knowledge. And I think you know, that's what we need to see in our leaders. And unfortunately, you know, so we live in this kind of shouting culture of ours where the loudest voice seems to prevail. And I think we need a more thoughtful approach to some of these problems. We need people who understand that taking a minute to think it through and explain why it's complex and needs to be thought through, I think would be very valuable to all of us, either in a personal level or in a public level as well.
You talk about President Lech Walesa, and of course, Erie has a very proud and rich Polish-American population. It really is a melting pot of the country. A lot of immigrants who have come to the U.S. have moved and have called Erie home. President Bush will be in Erie on November the 9th. So I know we've gone over, but if you were going to ask him one question.
President Bush?
George W. Bush, what would you ask him?
Oh, I spent, you know, a certain amount of time with him. So what would I ask him?
Because you look at his
I'd ask him
9/11 to the collapse of the economy, and boy, he had twin events at the start and end of his administration.
You know, he's recently talked about the role of immigration in our society.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually heard him talk about that in the Oval Office. So this was not some epiphany that came to him later in life. And I guess the question I'd want to know is, does he regret not doing more about immigration or not explaining the value of it to our society? Or I don't want to put it in a negative way, but I mean to suggest that he, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, it was just such a magnificent job explaining the importance of a country that has so many people from different backgrounds. And maybe the correct question is, we've heard you on that. It's not something you just came to. You felt that way a long time. What do our public officials need to do to convey that better to the American people?
Ambassador Christopher Hill, on behalf of the Jefferson Educational Society and the residents of Northwest Pennsylvania, a huge thank you. You have been more than gracious with your time. President Bush will be in Erie, which will be an incredible week for the community in November. So we hope that the Erie audience will participate in that as well. But for tonight and for your insights, your book Outpost, which is right behind you, and for the work that you've done in representing America in so many different roles as a career foreign servant, we thank you for that, and we thank you for tonight.
Well, I want to thank you for including me. You have just an all-star cast of people. It is truly extraordinary and truly humbling to be asked to be a part of that. So, you know, if every town in America, if every city in America had this kind of approach, I think we would be a better country. So,
well, as I said at the beginning, the thanks goes to you because we couldn't do it without people like you agreeing to share your insights. So we can't wait for you to come to Erie, and I promise I'll come up there and show you the history of Oliver Hazard Perry and the flagship Niagara and the War of 1812. A lot of rich and wonderful history in Northwest Pennsylvania. So we thank you for that.
Can I just ask real quick, what's the NFL team that you root for?
Oh my goodness. Well, here's the problem, since you asked. Erie is situated between Buffalo, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. So the art of diplomacy is depending on which team is doing well, but we can root on all three teams. But I'm going to turn to the expert in that, which is Ben Spagin. So Ben, I'll have you answer that. But a very astute question, Ambassador Hill. I thank you for that. There's actually a bar in Erie that has the Steelers, the Browns, and the Bills. So depending on where you are at the bar, you can determine who you're supporting.
And that, of course, is the right answer for tonight. It is diplomacy. We practice what we preach in sports. And again, to our guest tonight, Mr. Christopher Hill, a career diplomat, four-time ambassador, and man of many, many other accomplishments, as we learned tonight, including being the author of Outpost, Life on the Front Lines of American Diplomacy, out and available for sale. Link on our website, jeserie.org. Thank you, thank you, thank you for sharing your insights, your knowledge, your firsthand experience with us here at the JES. And of course, a big thanks too to Mr. Steve Scully, the chairman of the JES's Global Summit Speaker Series, for moderating tonight's lively, thought-provoking, and just absolutely wonderful conversation. And of course, thanks goes out to our entire team at the JES under the leadership of our president, Dr. Furky Faradi, and to the JES Board of Trustees under the leadership of our chairwoman, Joyce Savacchio, and to all of our event sponsors, Erie Insurance, the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, Erie News Now, WQLN Public Media, and the American Tapestry Project, and to our Global Summit event partner, the City Club of Cleveland. And of course, to all of you watching along at home, thank you for tuning in. These programs and discussions and the exchange of information and ideas would not be possible without you. Folks, for more information about the JES, including how to register for additional Global Summit events, please visit jeserie.org. There, you're also going to find videos of other past presentations available to stream on demand and publications, including reports, essays, and timely writings, as well as information about other JES initiatives, including the Civic Leadership Academy and Ramey Fellows Program. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagin. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.